Now that we've set up our first web app, let's add a bit of interactivity by creating a black overlay that will hide the thumbnails. We'll be using that overlay later in this chapter to show a high resolution version of the images when we click on a thumbnail. First, we need to add a div to create an overlay. We're going to do this at the bottom of the UL tag. Now we're going to style our overlay, and I've given it a background color of black, sized it to cover the entire page, and positioned it on top of all the other images. I've also changed the Z index. The Z index is like a stacking order, kind of like a bunch of playing cards. The higher Z indexes will cover images with lower Z indexes. So now our overlay is covering up our thumbnails. So we need to put the thumbnails back on top. Just adding a Z index is not going to move the thumbnails to the front. We also need to make sure we set the position attribute to absolute. And now you see our images are coming up to the front. Finally, we need to hide the overlay because we don't want it to be showing normally. Setting the opacity to 0 will hide the overlay. It'll still be there, but it just won't be visible until we need it. We want to set up some styles for our overlay to fade in and fade out. So as you can see, our fade in overlay has an opacity of 1, which will make it show, and a Z index of 30, so it'll show up in front. Our fade out resets the index to 5 so that it's behind the thumbnails. We need to modify the list of images so that they're clickable. So we're adding an on-click handler that will run a function called showImage, which we'll program in just a bit. We're going to add our first bit of JavaScript, and it's important that you put it in the head tags so it loads before the rest of the page loads. Make sure you put it after or before the style tag. The first thing we do is set the class of the overlay to fade in. Our fade in style will take care of changing the order so that it's in the front and changing the opacity to 1 so that it's visible. Finally, we're going to add an on-click handler to the overlay itself so that when we click on the overlay, its class will be set to fade out. This is interesting. You can set an on-click handler to an element that is on screen. So it'll wait for a click on an element that you have created dynamically or that sits somewhere on the screen. And we do that with programming right here. Once we set the name to fade out, then the style will change to this, which will move the overlay backwards behind the thumbnails and make it invisible again. So as you can see, when we click on any image, it shows the overlay. And when we click on the overlay, it hides the overlay. Now that's not a very interesting transition. So let's program some of the transition effects. So as you can see, I've programmed a 500 millisecond ease out transition on the overlay. That way, when we click on it, it'll fade in with that transition. And when we click on the overlay itself, it'll fade out with that transition again. We've used a few concepts that we've learned about in previous chapter and added some JavaScript to make things interactive. We learned how we can target elements in the document with getElementById, and we can add elements in order to trigger transitions.